This is basically a tutorial on the rear wheel bearing and hub removal on a 2000 to 2006 Lincoln LS. Was having noises in the rear hub, sounded like grinding, metal on metal, the whole 9 yards. The tools you will need is a 36mm socket, a 15, 13, a 15mm wrench, works great, a 13/16 socket, a 18mm socket, ratchet 8mm, and you will also need, best thing that I found that works is the hub remover. You'll grab a hold of these two top studs and this bottom one and get a slide hammer. That removes the hub fairly easily and the quickest. Before you do all that, you need a 3/4 inch socket or lug wrench to remove the lugs. Before you take the tire off, be sure and loosen up the axle nut. Makes it 10 times easier. Take the wheel off, and then you're going to proceed to take off the brakes. The caliper, 13mm on the back, and then take off the bracket. That's a 15. Once that's all off, you take off the rotor. Then you also have, right back here, is the wheel speed sensor, 8mm socket. Then you also have the upper control arm. Don't remember what size that was. Then you have the toe link, which is 13 on top, 15 on bottom. And the lower control arm. That is a 18 on this side, and on the other side is a 13/16. Once you get all that loosened up, take bolts out, hub falls right off. Take a mallet, hit the axle. Should just slide back. Don't use any kind of sledgehammer. Just use a mallet. It should be loose enough that it will just fall back in there. And if you do use a hammer, make sure, hold on a second. Make sure that it's flush with the axle itself before you start hammering on it. If you do, or if you have it in too far, you'll damage the threads. If you have it out too far, then you'll damage the nut. And no, there's been several questions on if you have to replace the axle nut. No, you do not. If it falls apart while you're taking it off, yes, you have to replace it. The only place you can get it is the dealership. I don't remember the price on it. As for the wheel bearing, if you use the hub puller and the slide hammer, the hub will already be out, but it'll still have the bearing sleeve on the hub. As for the bearing, don't believe you can actually get the tool to replace or to press out the old bearing and press the new one in. Best thing to do, find a machine shop. A lot of times they'll do it for you, of course, for a charge. When you're putting everything on, it's pretty much the reverse concept. You shouldn't have to. When you take off the brake caliper, the piston's already out to where your brake pads were set, so you shouldn't have to repress it. It's pretty much the reverse process. And when it comes to the axle nut, best way to do that as well, tighten it on with an impact or as tight as you can get it. Then set the tire back on the ground and then take a torque wrench. See if we can get it to show. And we might not be able to. Anyway, 220 to 300 foot-pounds. I don't advise going all the way to 300. Go to 220, 230, somewhere around in there. You do not want to drive it on, or drive the axle nut on all the way with an impact. If you do, you risk breaking the whole axle, or you risk driving it in too far, and then you're going to squeeze that bearing to where it won't be able to move at all, and then you're just going to burn the bearing up. In my case, this is what the hub looked like when I took off the old bearing. So I had to go, of course, I went to a junkyard, got a new hub. Wasn't expensive. If you try going to the dealership, what it's going to be is it's going to be the bearing, the hub, and the knuckle. For that, it's going to be $1,200. I've already called, checked everywhere. No part stores carry it. Just the hub. The part stores, the only thing they can get is the wheel bearing. The hub, you either have the option of going to the dealership or junkyard. But if you go to the junkyard, make sure, if they give you the whole assembly, make sure you check, make sure there's no play in that hub or that bearing. If there is play between the bearing and the hub on the back, then that's signs of this right here. It's rough right here and smooth on the inner side. What happened is that bearing wore out, and that hub started moving around in that bearing. So it started to chatter against it. On the back side is where the axle started beating against it too. It's not hard. It's not a hard job. I did it myself. Worst part about it is the bearing. If you don't line it up correctly, you risk damaging the knuckle. We don't want to do that. Best case scenario, take it to the machine shop, let them do it. Or if you have a friend with a press, see if they can do it. But make sure they line everything up properly. When pressing it in, you want to get the outer lip. Hold on, let's see if we have one. Hold on, I'll show you on the one that I got from the junkyard. When pressing in the bearing, or pressing in the hub, on the back side of it, you want to put something against this. If you don't, you're going to press this bearing out, because it's a two-piece bearing. You're going to press this side out on the other side while you're pressing the hub in. And this is what I'm talking about. When you're pressing the hub in, you want to get this outer sleeve, or this inner sleeve. When you're pressing the actual bearing in, you want to get this inner sleeve right here. And another thing, on the back of this hub, there is a lock ring retainer. I don't know if you can see the groove, but it's right there. There's a lock ring retainer. You have to get that out, get the hub off if you haven't already. And then you're going to go from this back side, or actually it'd be the front side of the hub, or the knuckle. You're going to go on this lip right here, which is the shoulder or race for this bearing that you pulled out when you pulled the hub. Put something up against it, should just fall right out. Now, yes, it's going to pop a little bit. Don't get scared. Don't think you're going to break it. The aluminum knuckle is actually pretty strong, but don't go crazy on it. I don't recommend using a hydraulic press unless you have no other option. We used a jack handle press. But you're going to press against this lip to get the bearing out of the old sleeve, or the old bearing out of the knuckle. And you're going to do it the opposite way when you're pressing it in. You're going to press in from this side, press in from this side, and then Once that's all in, you put the retainer clip in, flip it back over, and you're going to press the hub in this way. But be sure you put something on the back side while you're pressing it. Put something on the back side on this inner ring. If you do not, the hub will press this bearing out. And that is pretty much the basics of changing a wheel bearing and removing a hub.